Thank you, David. I was sitting here at 7:20 in front of an empty room, and I thought, well, this is a good exercise in humility. Because last time I was here, I didn't have to wait until 7:20 to see whether anyone was interested in listening to me, because back then, in 2022, the things that I'm talking about in this book were lively and topical, and the discussion around bicultural partnership and the future shape of Aotearoa, all of those things were on the table and people were engaged in the conversation. And that book that David held up, Becoming Pākehā, was a book that I had no trouble publishing. In fact, I was invited by HarperCollins to write it, and it just felt like it was topical and welcome in the national debate. And how things have changed, The title of the book, Living on the Fault Line, I owe to Glenn Colquhoun, who's a Northland GP and a wonderful poet. And he wrote an open letter in the Listener to David Seymour saying, "Dear David, please come back to your people in the north, to your Te Rahia people. Come back, sit down, talk to them, and listen to them about what it is to live on the fault line in this country." And I thought that was a wonderful image. So I borrowed it and taken it as the title for this book. And I wrote the book over the last year, the last months of the last government and the first months of the new coalition government. And I tried to adjust the conversation to addressing what it feels like now to live on the fault line, because the earlier book, written in 2022, was about a different place, and it feels like 100 years ago. Back in 2022, the Matariki Festival had been launched and become an official festival in the New Zealand calendar. The topic of co-governance was one that was on people's lips, and we were talking about it. We had a memorial Jim White lecture series on the topic, and people like the trustees of Richmond Primary School came and talked about what it feels like to run a school on that principle. And Three Waters were still flowing. I should have watched the warning signs, because in that year a sign appeared on the side of a hay barn in the area where I live in Pakari, saying, "Stop Three Waters." And at the time I thought, well, that's a fairly extreme thing to be cascading across the countryside, and didn't think much more about it. Well, we know what's happened to Three Waters. The Stop Three Waters sign is still on the side of that hay barn today, and it's interesting that no one's bothered to take it down. 2022, Ruby Tui had led the women's rugby team to the World Cup victory just a few months before. And you remember those scenes at the end of that game at Eden Park where the crowd went wild, congratulating this Maori heroine, this sporting star. And people felt good about that. Well, all of that was a long time ago. And I decided to learn from the response to that first book about the mood of the country and how people were responding to the sort of things that I had said about bicultural partnership. The publisher sent me on a tour around the country, and I spoke and listened to people all around New Zealand. And there were a number of questions that kept popping up as we talked about that earlier book. The biggest one, and it was posed to be a Maori woman in the audience in Christchurch, who came up at the end of my presentation when everyone else had gone and said, I've only got one question to ask you. What are Pākehā afraid of? And I was taken aback. I didn't quite know how to respond, and I stumbled and fumbled for a while, and then I said, well, I think maybe it's got something to do with the fact that we've been sitting in the front seat of this bus for a long time, and now we're being asked to move back a few rows. I think that's probably what's going on. Ah, okay, she said, and walked off into the night. And that exchange kind of stayed with me because I think a lot of what has happened since 2022 and a lot of what has happened in the whole debate around the Treaty Principles Bill is that many Pākehā people are afraid of what the future looks like for this country. And I have written Living on the Fault Line to try and address that sense of fear, perhaps that's too strong a word, but certainly discomfort, awkwardness about where we are going as a country. The other thing that was a common theme in the response to the first book was an ambivalence about this word Pākehā, a sense that a lot of people, and the surveys have shown this, a lot of people who are not Maori but want to belong here are very uncomfortable about that word. There's a whole lot of myths around it. Only last Sunday at a after match function at a local church in Warkworth, I was taken aside by a lady who told me, you know, don't you, that Pākehā means white flea. And I have been taken aside by lots of well-meaning Pākehā people to be told what this word really means and that it's really an insult. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the history of that because it's all laid out in that earlier book. But it is a word that is not easily worn by many people. And of course, it does have a very specific focus to people who have a European, especially a British background. So it's very difficult for Indian New Zealander or a Chinese New Zealander to identify with that word. And so this new book is an attempt to say, well, let's hold that Pākehā story because it's a vital piece of our history. But let's look for a word that's more inclusive. And of course, that word, the word that everybody seems to be happy with, is the word Kiwi. Why can't we all be Kiwis together? Well, that's nice. It's a bit like saying, why can't we all be equal together? But we need to be able to unpack the word a bit, and we need to be able to recognise that Māori are equally Kiwi. It's a word that's so inclusive that it begs questions about the specific histories that flow into that overarching identity. So I want to work that through in the book, and I do that in some detail, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing that happened as I went around the country listening to people was there were a number of myths that kept cropping up, repeated over and over again, spoken as though they were received wisdom, unquestioned. The most common one, of course, is, well, we're all equal, aren't we? Begging any question about the difference between equality and equity, implying that somehow we are all the same. And of course, in terms of our common humanity, we are all the same, but that's only the first part of the sentence. To make any real meaning, you've got to add something else. Another myth that kept cropping up is that, well, actually, there is a kind of hierarchy of value in racial and ethnic backgrounds. And frankly, as people kept taking me aside to reassure me, there are some races, there are some ethnicities that are better than others, actually, that have got more built-in gifts that are somehow on a slightly higher plane, which is it's a shocking thing to be saying in 2025, but that was a very common myth that was peddled. There's also some very uncomfortable ones, mostly referring to poor and disadvantaged people. And the myth there is that somehow the people who are unfortunate, who are poorer, who are dispossessed, that somehow it's at least in part their fault. They haven't tried hard enough. They haven't worked hard enough. They haven't taken the opportunities that we have taken that they should have taken too. And that's a very deep-seated myth that still haunts us and lies in the background of this discussion. Another myth, which is very common, and Dr. Don Brash has got something to answer for on this one, good Presbyterian though he is, and I have to acknowledge that. But yes, our history has got some unfortunate features to it, but it's my grandfather's problem, not mine. These issues that we have inherited from our colonial history, I can't be held accountable for that. That's the fault of people that have gone before me, and it doesn't help any of us to stay bogged down in that. So that is another myth that kept floating past me as I began this discussion. This book, as I said, tries to dig down behind these myths that frame us and these words that define us, words like Pākehā, words like Kiwi. And what I've tried to do in this book is to try and explore that the things that let us belong here, that give us a sense of identity and rootedness in this landscape, are actually incredibly complex. They have to do with all sorts of things that don't even seem to be visible on the surface, as it were. How we belong here in Aotearoa has always been a shaky business, especially for Pākehā who want to call these islands home. Connecting with this unstable land has been easier for Māori who had about 1,000-year head start than for those of us whose whakapapa stretches back less than 200 years. You can build an identity on time served here, but there is a deeper connection. All of us are recent arrivals compared to the life that preceded us here. Our oldest rocks date back more than 500 million years. All life, ours included, either swam or floated or was blown here from somewhere else. We are a nation of arrivers, early, middle, and late. From the first Polynesian voyages to the latest immigrants off the plane from Mumbai or Manchester. And we're all working out how to belong here together alongside each other. The old slogan, Pākehā go home, isn't heard in public anymore, however much it might be devoutly wished more privately. And the anti-immigrant rant that Pākehā politicians aimed at Chinese miners and the laws they passed 150 years ago to stem more aliens arriving, that's muted now, though it still lurks in the dark corners of the internet and surfaces again as it did in 2019 with the Christchurch massacre of 51 Muslim New Zealanders. Racially and culturally, along with the climate emergency and the yawning poverty gap, we live in crisis times. What was once a question of how to keep standing on shaky ground has now become a matter of survival. Who we think we are, the search for how to belong here, and what we call ourselves in order to feel at home and survive in this place is as shaky as ever, especially for those who are not tangata whenua. The question of what we call ourselves in this struggle to find a way of standing on the fault line. The question is about these words, Pākehā and Kiwi. Back in the early 1980s, I wrote a little booklet called Pākehātanga and went around the country running workshops on trying to decide what that really was about. It was a rather self-conscious exercise, but at the time it felt important. We made these attempts to define what Pākehā was all about. A writer called David McGill, who wrote for the Listener, had a lot to say about it at the time. Writing in the Listener, McGill said, more out of sorrow than anger, he describes his cultural identity as a Pākehā as a mongrel mixture that amounts to nothing much in particular in a land best suited to sheep and tourist cameras. Certainly, he wrote, one feels a New Zealander when you're overseas, but when you come home to the gloomy orange lights of Newmarket, Willis Street, or the streets off Cathedral Square, then you're no longer not so sure of yourself. New Zealanders as spiritual beings was a subject that he wrote about in The Listener, and he ends that reflection by saying, maybe we should all go to Taupo for the weekend, make a Pākehā marae out of it, and find some Pākehā-tanga. That was the tone and the mood of that discussion at the time. Self-conscious, Winston Peters would have called it woke to the extreme. And yet it was an attempt to try to describe what it is that makes us able to belong here. The word Kiwi, of course, is a much more inclusive word, and a word that has taken over the discussion. Kiwi New Zealander is as inclusive a description as you could ever hope to find. It means what Dame Jacinda meant in 2019 after the Christchurch mosque tragedies, when she said of the Muslim community, they are us and we are one. Kiwi is the word that overarches all the differences, all our grievances and dissatisfactions, letting one awkward bird brand us together. And part of that branding will always start with the tangata whenua, who prized this bird from long ago, gave it its name, used its feathers as a cloak of honour. The restoration of Kiwi birds from the threat of extinction has been a bicultural affair. Their survival is the result of a co-governing, resource-sharing campaign. Few creatures have been so thoroughly assimilated into Pākehā culture, but they, of course, have always been part of Māori culture. You need to say this carefully, but being Kiwi is about being assimilated in both cultural directions, however ambiguous a blessing that might be. It is a very ambiguous business for Māoridom, where assimilation is a dirty word, a threat to Te Tino Rangatiratanga and Māori control over all things Māori. But beyond that threat, and where Māori are in charge of their destiny and their resources, Assimilation can also be a mutual blessing, a meeting and sharing of the best things Maori and the best things Pākehā, Western and Indigenous knowledge coexisting. Assimilation is an inevitable feature of our landscape, regardless of whether you call it New Zealand or Aotearoa. But we can't ignore that for many Māori, assimilation will remain a negative word, even an exercise in cultural genocide. The issue is always who controls the process, and it has invariably been controlled on Pākehā terms. So we may need to replace it with a word that is less damaging, but it does describe a process that is etched into our humanity. A better, less loaded word is to describe the cultural cross-fertilization that benefits both partners, to describe that as entanglement. If we're going to work together, we need to find words that both partners can use without insulting each other. To manage that cultural chemistry is always challenging, as Sir Apirananata said in his correspondence with James Carroll, one foot on the Pākehā brake and the other on the Māori accelerator. How will the car stand it? Being Kiwi, being Pākehā, is always an entangled business. It's shaped and formed by what we eat, what we wear, how we speak, where we live, in what sort of houses, in town or in country. All of those things are shaping this identity that we call Kiwi, we call Pākehā. And I've got a chapter on each of those things where I explore the deep and rich history between the things that we eat and the things that we wear and the way in which we speak, and the things that we believe. Because we also have a number of myths that we carry with us that shape who we think we are. And I list some of those. One of my favorite ones is the myth of the underdog. Writer, filmmaker, and theologian Mike Riddell suggests that the underdog is expressed in the Pākehā fascination with gambling. The lone battler up against the odds and winning through intelligence and intuition. That's a part we long to play. It upsets the old Calvinistic piety of success coming only to those who work hard enough. It's much easier to take a lotto ticket or a punt on a horse and savour the delight of an undeserved win. Nothing beats the pleasure of overturning the odds stacked against you. But when we do win, we prefer to keep quiet. Battlers don't gloat about their victories for fear of sounding self-congratulatory. Yet this idea of coming from behind and punching above our weight does resonate. We are hyper-conscious of being a small country with limited resources, having to try harder to be noticed. Being confused with Australia or treated as their add-on infuriates us. The insult is eased only by beating them on the sporting field. And to do that, though, we need to be careful about choosing the right sport. We do 4 times better at competing in rugby, which is a major Australians, But the opposite imbalance applies to cricket. We weren't considered good enough to even compete with them until the middle of the 20th century. And we didn't win a test match until 1974. So this business of identity is bound up in all of these things that we sometimes take for granted. We live in imagined places. These imagined places are formed by the myths that we inherit, the attitudes we assume, the privileges we think we're entitled to, the ideas that shape who we think we are. They feel as real and as solid as the ground beneath our feet. And yet they are constructs that are constantly being rebuilt, and nowhere more radically than here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. That is really what this book is about, exploring those imagined stories that shape us and form us so powerfully. I make some comparisons with other people from colonial backgrounds. I tell stories of white South Africans and white Australians and how they negotiate their colonial legacies, which is very illuminating to us and also very sobering. When you think of the story of the Dutch colonists in Indonesia, for example, where they had a thriving culture and economy, and today have almost disappeared without trace. And then the book is about the future, because it is a hopeful book, despite the chaos that's around us in the political scene. The treaty, Te Tiriti, is still regarded, even by some of our most conservative leaders, as being foundational. It is not hard to find people on the far right as well as the left to acknowledge that the treaty is our founding document, in the same way that the Magna Carta and the Constitution is regarded. But when it comes to working out how that treaty might be expressed in contemporary terms, in contemporary life, well, the divisions that we have been living through are all evident. And the search for models of a constitutional shape for our country that would honour the treaty and hold together the rights and values of all the partners, that's where things break down. A valiant attempt to try and sketch out some of those outlines was made in the document He Puapua that saw a very brief life before it retreated to the back shelf under the Labour government. But that was only one of a whole series of attempts to try to put some frame and language around possible new models of what is effectively co-governance. And back in the year 2000, Sir Paul Reeves chaired a constitutional conference in Wellington where models for a future parliament that would reflect a co-governance model were put forward and debated. And Sir Paul's conclusion at the end of that conference was, we managed to offend everybody in equal parts. And that was a bit of a stalemate, really. The Anglican Church had tried 10 years before with a new constitution to suggest some new constitutional models, and Professor Richard Sutton of Otago University led a team that went around the country discussing some possible models. But all of that very quickly came to a grinding halt when the hikoi went to Parliament to protest against poverty, and Whakahuihui Verko, the Maori Archbishop at the time, introduced the topic of constitutional reform and was very firmly put in place by now then Prime Minister Shipley as being a topic that was not welcome and to be taken off the table. So we've had this debate about the future shape of our country in terms of governance in fits and starts for a long time. Despite the lack of clarity about that, we still have to somehow learn to live on this fault line. A final word. Learning to live on this fault line, just like the million-year-old geology of that image, is hard to hurry. Pākehā have lived here for less than 200 years. The treaty that gives us the right to call this place home has only begun to be honoured for half a century or less. Any of our forebears who arrived in the first century of colonial settlement came into what was effectively a war zone and later an uneasy truce. The breach of trust experienced by Maori through land confiscation, language bans, corrupt lawmaking, second-class citizenship, that takes generations to heal. It takes time to ensure that promises are honoured, and even longer when they are broken over and over. But we can dare to believe it will happen. As Te Reo Māori is increasingly spoken easily in the schoolroom, as brown faces balance white on the sport field and in council chambers, as bicultural families become more commonplace, this trust will grow and the bicultural conversation will become more honest, lighter, and even funnier. In the meantime, expect more discomfort as we learn to find our feet across this fault line. Aotearoa New Zealand, as a country based on a treaty like no other in the world, is an unfinished experiment. We are yet to translate the promises of 1840 into the parliament and the courtrooms of the 2020s. We're still a work in progress and will be until we make progress on constitutional reform and the inequalities, the inequities of housing, health, education, childcare, and climate change. Fault lines are not cosy places to live on. A very old friend of mine and several of you, especially Alan Davidson, Peter Matheson, died a couple of weeks ago after a long career as a wonderful historian and prophet. And I want to end by quoting some words of his. A final note on finding our balance on the fault line and bringing in a bicultural future. The changes in ecological and economic policies will have to be legislated, budgeted, and strategically planned, but that won't be enough. Professor Peter Matheson once said, talking about eradicating poverty, that it's not going to happen by passing more laws and regulations. We're going to have to dance and sing our way into it. drawing on our deepest resources of imagination and inspiration and faith. Dancing the bicultural tango. And so it is with honouring the treaty. There are too many ideas of embedded privilege, superiority, and plain old racism still rampant. New laws alone won't overturn them. It will take a change of heart, and that only happens when we dare to let go and dance and dream a little. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I was just reflecting.
No, tell me more about that.
Well, you've talked about constitutional reform,
Yes.
and Moana Maniapoto has very colourfully and imaginatively talked about Mataki Mai, and I wondered if that's something that you
Just unpack that for me, because I'm not. I haven't followed that.
well, he and Margaret Mutu and others went all over the country and spoke to Marais and came up with a constitutional thing, Mataki Mai. And I think it's interesting that you don't, or that, you know, it's not commonly known. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no. I'm sorry. I'm not on board with that.
But perhaps an interesting point about, as John was saying, there have been multiple attempts, including more recent ones. Moana Jackson, I know, is another prominent person involved, I think, with that process.
Did I say you did? I mean Moana Jackson.
Moana Jackson, rather.
Not
Moana.
Okay. Moana Jackson. I'm sorry. I didn't know who Moana Maniapoto was.
Sorry. My apologies.
Yeah. Well.
So Moana is yeah.
Well, I think Moana Jackson's writing about that has had a big influence on what I was trying to express, and we've got this range of models that move from the sort of thing that Willie Jackson talks about, which is essentially a kind of co-governance model, through to the most radical exponents of Tino Rangatiratanga, which basically says that sovereignty was never ceded in the treaty, and that's the range of scholars that I've read, from Ned Fletcher on the Pākehā side through to Moana Jackson on the other, would mostly agree with that. I mean, it's very difficult to understand how a strong Maori majority in 1840 would say, well, we're going to give all this away. And, you know, that comes back to the question of whether you, which text you give priority to, the Maori or the English text. And international law agrees that it's the indigenous text that is the prevalent one, and so on. The issue is, I don't think, trying to argue that the Maori chiefs did something really stupid and weren't thinking and didn't know what they were doing. I mean, that's just plain insulting. The question is, how do you negotiate a livable partnership, given what's happened, and short of abolishing private title? How do you begin to do justice to what is essentially a shared stake? And the treaty settlement process was a first attempt to do that. But what we lack is a framework, an agreement on a constitutional structure that enables that kind of power sharing, mutual respecting to be continued. And we have failed abysmally in doing that, having made such a strong attempt to do it 20, 30 years ago. So we're in an impasse now. And you might take some small comfort from the fact that the Treaty Principles Bill only survived the first reading. But it's small comfort because it still leaves a vacuum. And I grieve for the fact that our churches, who once had a strong voice in this conversation, seem to have, what I think, abdicated their responsibility, really, to continue what began so well in the early 1990s.
Okay. Another question?
Oh, that's great.
You mention your book clearly addresses biculturalism.
Yeah.
Several times you use the word bicultural. The reality is that we're a multicultural country. We have we've got Asians, we've got Indians.
Yep.
The white British European Pakistan and Maori represent about 60% of our total population, or thereabouts.
And shrinking. Yeah.
Yes, so the other 40% is what? Indian and different nationalities. How does that get represented in the book?
Well, it gets represented by the word Kiwi, because all of those different ethnicities want to belong here. They didn't come from India and China and any more than they came from Manchester to form an exclusive cultural enclave that would be protected from the others. They came to join what is in fact a multicultural society. But you don't walk into this country and walk into a neutral ground. You walk into a place with a history, and a history that is founded on a treaty. And the treaty is about a partnership. And the way ahead for anyone who wants to belong here is to find their place as tangata tiriti, the people of the treaty. And that's the way forward, I think, not to diminish or dishonor the richness of the ethnic diversity, but to connect it so that we can live alongside each other with dignity and with justice. And that, I think, the word for that is not Pākehā or even Kiwi. The first word is tangata tiriti. In all the conversations that we have been having about what the future of this country looks like, I have yet to hear a viable alternative to a treaty-based, constitutionally framed democracy that's based on the premise of partnership. And that's something that, whatever your ethnic background is, you are accountable to and you can benefit from. So I think to play bicultural off against multicultural is a hiding to nowhere. And I think we've got to change our language so that we talk with words like Kiwi, like tangata tiriti, that everybody, regardless of where they come from, can claim and make their own.
cookbook, John, it will say chop to kiwi. So I remember them saying, they don't call them kiwi fruit, they call them kiwi. But I'm just wondering, in the present environment, when we have such a dominant culture in terms of our parliament, you know, you look at it and it's completely based on United Kingdom. And so when our treaty partner does what for them is a perfectly appropriate response to an appalling bill, they get, punished in a way that nobody has ever been punished before. I just can't see until we actually dismantle these colonial structures that we can really move forward.
Yeah. Well, I think that whole Privileges Committee saga just demonstrates how inadequately we have evolved the framework of our parliament. I mean, even before you talk about upper house or treaty house or any of the other ideas, the fact that the ground rules for the way in which we talk to each other are so woefully locked in a Victorian mindset is, well, because we haven't done the homework, because we haven't got those protocols negotiated and worked out, we end up with the kind of terrible collisions that we're still waiting to see played out, and delaying it till after the budget doesn't help it at all.
Hello. John, I'm interested in your use of the word entanglement and the whole question as to how far there can be face-to-face engagement in ways that are creative rather than the kind of confrontational ways that we see, for example, in parliaments.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I reflect on with the Anglican Church's constitutional changes in the 1990s was that in some senses it gave the partners the opportunity to move away from each other. Without that regular face-to-face, you had it at the synod level, at the big level, but at the micro level, there was, how do we ensure there's an ongoing engagement that is...
Well, we have brave and courageous leaders who make sure that the brave and courageous decisions that they made are actually followed through in the kind of detail we were talking about in terms of how people talk to each other in Parliament. The Anglican Church passed what was a revolutionary constitution in 1992, and part of the commitment of that constitution was to engage in what was called common life hui, so that we committed ourselves as a church to make sure that the separate tikanga, Māori, Pacifica and Pākehā, would continue to meet regularly on a 2-year cycle to engage around the key issues of evangelism, ministry and so on and so on. It happened for 2 years, and then for some reason it faded away and it hasn't happened since. So it was a failure by our leadership to continue the commitment that they had made in the Constitution by making sure it was grounded in the way in which we actually meet and touch and talk together. And that kind of isolation from each other is only a reflection of the kind of isolation that you see across Auckland, where you basically have a series of ethnic enclaves where a white face is hardly ever seen here and a brown face is hardly ever seen there. My daughter is a teacher in a South Auckland school with a roll of 2,000 children, 2% are Pākehā. And she is one of the few Pākehā teachers. And she's called the White Lady. And she took a group of her students to the museum for a art exhibition, and the kids were interviewed by the staff because they were very pleased to have this group of Maori and Pacific students coming to see the exhibition, and they wanted to make good public relations material out of it. And my daughter talked to one of the students after they had been interviewed and said, "So how was that? How did it go?" And the young student said, "Oh, it was fine, miss. We just put on our white lady voice and they loved it." And that's the kind of, that's the kind of society that we live in. We live in silos. And it's not just the churches that have been separated from each other. It's the wider patterns of wealth and poverty. How do we break all that? Well, I just think every opportunity to build a conversation, a shared event, the Matariki Festival is a wonderful opportunity. And we just got to be more proactive about doing that. I think music and television and theatre do that incredibly well. And there's lots of modelling going on the sports field and on the music stage. But at the level of where we engage as churches, as communities, as workforces, we're way behind.
Ronnie Walker said that race relations would be solved in the bedroom.
Yes, well, that's very hopeful.
Yeah. Anyone else with a question? Yes.
Yeah. Kia ora, John. I'm curious. I love the talk of the myths, and I think we are a nation that has a lot of myths. I know Georgina Stewart talks about truth myths, and how those repeat the colonial thing that downplays Māori and lifts up Pākehā. And I think, and I wonder whether there's a large portion of we repeat those because we are ignorant of our own history. And I know that there are Māori academics like Arene Loda who talk about Māori have been shouldering the burden of history for so long. Isn't it time that we as Pākehā start to share some of that historical burden and actually learn our own histories and how those are woven in with colonialism, the colonisation of Aotearoa, and instead of ignoring the Māori stories, but actually begin to go, this is how my family came here, and as uncomfortable as it is, that is how I have ended up here 5, 4, 6 generations on. And where do you see that going if we can do that?
You should have written this book, actually. Well, I think if we dig into our Pākehā history, not just the injustices that we perpetrated and the indignities that we inflicted, but also the kind of food we cooked, the kind of clothes we wore, the kind of speech patterns we developed, the kind of houses we built, the way in which we developed horticulture, we will feel, as Pākehā people, well, actually, there's part of our story that's inspiring. There's part of our story that needs to be celebrated. And I think what Maori need more than anything right now is a partner, a Pākehā partner, a Kiwi partner, who can stand and talk with confidence, repent where you need to, and we do, but we don't have to be on the back foot all the time. One of the problems with this book is that whereas I could find a publisher without any trouble for the first one, I have great difficulty finding a publisher for this one. I have no success in getting any coverage of it on Radio New Zealand or in the New Zealand Listener, these liberal expressions of our media, because there is a sense in which people think if it comes to a bicultural matter, Māori should be doing the talking and Pākehā need to be quiet. Well, I totally disagree with that. I think what we have to do as Pākehā people is find our voice and to join the conversation, because otherwise we end up what Alan was describing, where we just separate from each other completely. And that's not going to help anybody.